Morning. I love it when people respond good morning. It's already a great group. Welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Ann Bowser, the Director of Innovation here at the Wilson Center, and I am co-hosting today's event along with Andrew Hill and Molly John. President Woodrow Wilson is the only U.S. president to have earned a PhD. And to memorialize Dr. Wilson, Congress chartered this institution as his living memorial. The Wilson Center is a unique type of institution called a federal trust instrumentality. On one hand, we are a registered nonprofit committed to rigorous academic research and scholarship. On the other, we are a government entity receiving congressional appropriations that is mandated to ensure that our work is actionable to the government and public policy communities. We hold ourselves accountable to academic, government, and policy communities, and also recognize the role that our partners in the private sector play, contributing thought leadership and strengthen implementation. Within the Wilson Center, today's event is a collaboration between the Global Risk and Resilience Program and my program, the Science and Technology Innovation Program. Both programs share an affinity for understanding and translating complex issues, and the perspective that most of today's critical problems are systemic in nature. The Science and Technology Innovation Program also has a strong portfolio in data governance, in data innovation, and in cybersecurity. With this background in mind, the opportunity to host this event as an initial entry into the food systems community felt like a fantastic fit. I'd like to thank a few of the people who made today possible. Alex Long, Liam Hutchinson, Taryn Otto, and Braden Rimmerstadt are the people who did all of the work. Their efforts were enabled by the generosity of Holt Logistics, Refinitiv, and an anonymous donor. Finally, I'd like to thank Andrew Hill for his strategic leadership and Molly John for being our center of gravity. We're truly delighted to help this unfold.
Thank you, Anne, and thanks to the Wilson Center for being here and being a place that a community like ours can convene. I'm Molly John. I have the privilege of serving as Director of Strategic Outreach for a consortium that NASA has funded focused on food security and food systems called the Harvest Consortium. And this meeting really is a collaboration between the NASA Harvest Consortium community and the U.S. Army War College, bringing forward issues specifically focused around food systems, which is different from food security, but not unrelated, and particularly bringing that subject into the context of national security. There are a few people in the audience I need to acknowledge right off the bat. The first is Tom Lovejoy. Tom caught sight of me when I was in government, which is where I caught sight of these concerns. And he said, "Oh, I know. I'm starting a big seminar series at the Wilson Center." As soon as I returned to my faculty life, he said, "Dennis Dimmock, Executive Director of National Geographic, he'll have 20 minutes to tell us what the problem is, and you'll have 20 minutes to tell us what the solution is." And it's wonderful to have Tom here in the front row, back to, in essence, report where we got. Another person to whom I owe a great deal of thanks is Peter Brooks here in the front. Peter said, "Make sure you convey a sense of urgency." And I want to do that because this topic, far from ordering itself into a comfortable bucket, has only grown and spread. And so you will see the caliber of the people we have here and those of you in the audience. The fact that we were able to fill the house the Thursday before Memorial Day, that should be a testament to the urgency of this issue. There is a feature of our conversation today that's crucially important. When I began this effort, I was at U.S. Department of Agriculture. I couldn't imagine that we didn't have this topic covered in government. I just didn't know who had it covered. And I began the walk that brought me here sometimes run, sometimes I'm hiding under my desk, because it has the magnitude of the vulnerabilities that we are tolerating in the homeland as well as globally, the inadequacy of our 19th and 20th century institutions to deal with these kinds of threats and vulnerabilities. Likewise, the inadequacy of some of our thinking to capture the potential opportunities and shortcuts to a more stable and sufficient future for all. All of those things have snapped into focus in this journey. You will see a wide array of backgrounds represented, from logistics and infrastructure. We have military, active and retired. We have many of you. We have financial. We're very grateful to Refinitiv for their support as a data company. So I hope you'll find this meeting extremely stimulating. This is not a show. You're all here for some reason, and we hope that you will do your business together today and that you will use the breakout groups this afternoon to identify communities that we will continue to move forward. So breakout group 1 is focused on the law that you see up around the wall. This is the National Defense Authorization Act 18. You're going to hear a panel on that. Clause 1 is the morning's business. Clause 4 will come up later in the day. And in the middle of that, we're delighted to have the Army War College and Andrew Hill releasing announcing the launch of this report, Implications of Climate Change for the U.S. Army. This is a report commissioned by General Milley, the incoming chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and we have several of the authors in the audience as well. So one of those authors is our next speaker, who will welcome you on behalf of the War College, Colonel Parker Frawley. He said, "I'm just a knuckle-dragging attack helicopter pilot." He's not, he is that. He is absolutely that. In this, but many of my best friends call themselves knuckle draggers, so and I don't think so. So we're really honored to have the collaboration with the military. One of the ironies is through 2016, we understood this correctly to be not only whole of government, but whole of world. However, as 2017 rolled forward, we increasingly came to realize that the traction we were going to get was in the Department of Defense lane. And so it's really been a very important and exciting set of relationships. We view ourselves still early in those relationships with the War College and with our colleagues who are here in uniform today. Colonel Frawley.
Thank you very much, Molly. So this is where my electronics fail me, I'm certain. So good morning. As Molly mentioned, I'm Colonel Parker Frawley. I'll be the third one this morning to welcome you here and thank you for your participation as we examine the extremely challenging issue of climate change and its impact on our food systems and national security. I'm here today along with my colleague, Dr. Andrew Hill, from, as Molly mentioned, the United States Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Currently, I'm on the faculty at the War College as the Director of Strategic Studies in the Department of National Security Studies. As the kind of perfect exemplar of the adage, those who can't do, teach, last year I was a student at the Army War College. So in fact, I was one of Dr. Hill's students. And in that role, I was fortunate to participate in a study considering the implications of climate change for the United States military. Also joining us today are a few of our other authors from the study, Lieutenant Colonel Mike Marchacek and Matt Rose. If you guys can just raise up your hand. Matt's in the back, and there's Mike right there. So very briefly, I'll explain some background for the War College so you can kind of understand our research endeavors and how we got after this challenging problem. Each year, a class of approximately 380 military officers and government civilians, including about 80 foreign officers, attend the Army War College for a single academic year. For most of them, successful completion of that year results in a diploma, a master's degree in strategic studies, and the requisite qualifications to advance to higher rank in positions of greater responsibility. The requirements for graduation include the student's solo completion of a strategic research project or the group completion of an integrated research project, or for those, my friends and I that I pointed out, both. The students generally select the research from a broad umbrella of topics formulated by the Army staff in an attempt to leverage the resources of the student population against complex and sometimes intractable problems. Dr. Hill created a program at the War College that's kind of separate from the general student population, where selected students can engage in research topics specifically at the direction of the Chief of Staff of the Army. So prior to the 2017-18 academic year, General Mark Milley, who was at that time the Army Chief of Staff, and as Molly mentioned, will be moving up to be the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he requested research into the national security implications surrounding the anticipated consequences of climate change. The concept was not to conduct climate research per se, nor to research specific causation, but to determine what the Army needed to do to set conditions for successful security adaptation. Dr. Hill will have a much more comprehensive overview when he delivers the second keynote shortly. For those of you that are interested, we have, we started out the morning with 20 copies of the full report and an additional 120 copies of the executive summary with recommendations. If you have any specific questions with respect to the study, please find one of the study authors today, and we'd be very happy to discuss it. Thank you in advance for your interest, and I look forward to our panels and breakout sessions today, where we examine the threats to global and national food systems. So my work here is done. I am honored to introduce the next podium occupant. Sharon Burke currently directs the Resource Security Program at New America. Belying current trends, she's worked extensively and successfully for both Republicans and Democrats in Congress. Don't be too shocked. And the executive branch. Most recently, she served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy. Ladies and gentlemen, Sharon Burke.
Thank you very much, Colonel. And hopefully you have another copy of that full study, because I'd like to see it. So I'm just delighted to be here today. And I would be anywhere that Molly John asked me to be. She's an important leader in this space and an innovator, and has been for a long time. So I can't wait to see what the day yields. But my role now is to introduce the next speaker. And I wanted to frame that with some thoughts. In the Bible, there are 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and that includes war and famine, and they ride together. And we've known that since the beginning of humanity, since people could first throw up a rock and throw it at each other, that there's an intimate relationship between hunger and conflict. Hunger causes conflict, conflict causes hunger. And we have now a time when we can understand those linkages better. But in the American system, that's not how we do it. We're compartmentalized. War is the business of the Department of Defense. And in these days, the emphasis is very much on lethality. Great power conflict. Hunger is the business of USAID. They work on that. Systems, and these modern systems that are far more interdependent than in the time of the Bible even, I think we'll find out more about that. Commerce, treasury, here and there. And that's why our next speaker is so important, because he's someone who's going to cut across these lanes for us. And he always has. So Lieutenant General Edward Cardona, graduate of West Point, where he was an engineer. He came out of West Point an engineer, a community that I've had the great privilege of working a lot with. And it's a hard-working community in the Army. They have an important warfighting role, but they're also the big brains. They think about the mechanics of war, everything from ordnance and improvised explosive devices to how to build. But he also is, I think, if you'll forgive the presumption, in the Army, a high compliment is a soldier's soldier. And this is a man who's been a warfighter and who's led in war at every level of command, including in combat in Iraq. He led in Korea. He led in Bosnia. So this is a war-tested leader as well. But not only that, he's a visionary. He led the Army's cyber command, I think at its inception, correct?
Second commander.
Second commander, which means that he really had to figure out how to do it. And this is a whole new type of warfare for the Army, for the U.S. Armed Forces. So it takes somebody who not only understands war, but also has an intellect and a vision. And then in his last job, running business transformation for the Army, he helped ink out what Army Futures Command is going to look like, which is both a significant institutional change for the Army and a recognition that the Army needs to think big and look at its horizons and think ahead, war game ahead, and not just limit to certain lanes or to things that we think we know or we want to see, or weapon systems that we want to prove are going to work the way we want them to. We have to have a bigger picture. And this is the man who's led on all of those ways. So for him to come here today and talk about how all these things fit together and why they matter signifies how seriously the Army takes this and how important a leader he is. And it's certainly my privilege and my pleasure to introduce him, and I can't wait to hear what you say.
Well, thank you very much, Sharon. I really appreciate that, and I'm going to capture the apocalypse. I think that's a great segue into this. And to build on your two comments right up front, I just want to ad-lib here a little bit. The big conclusion from Army Futures Command, why this is the newest 4-star command in the Army since 1973, is the recognition that current organizations, processes, and financial instruments cannot deliver the Army of the future. We've been trying that for a long time. So this is a new attempt. And, it's a 1-year-old that has a ways to go yet. And I think, General Mike Murray is doing a tremendous job there. But in some ways that brings me to here, but it's always useful to start off with, my mother was born in 1940 in Holland and lived through the Nazi occupation. And then people often forget that there were famines in Europe for the next couple of years. And so we in America, we don't really ever face starvation, but she has. And so I want you to put that as one frame. And then I grew up on a little farm. And we leased out the strawberries, but I saw every piece of system problem you could have, from labor problems, pest problems, went through the big drought in the 70s, and what it did to the agricultural, and then the way that reverberates through the system. And so today, when you go to the store, we just assume everything we want is going to be there. And I think most Americans pay little attention to the extensive supply chains and the entire food system that sits behind it. But yet we know this isn't true, even in small ways. So I live in Georgia now. Threat of a hurricane, stores are stripped, right? But nobody really starving, right? It's big, but it's not that big yet. Or fires or floods. And then we also have E. coli and these food scares that also tremendously impacts the system. And sometimes overseas we've seen food used as a weapon. And I think for the Army, our operations in Somalia showed this in a real way. So the question is the food system really secure? And to me, I want to start off with the definition of food security normally revolves around access, affordability, et cetera. But what I'm talking about here is a different kind of food security. The security of the system from farm to table, that it's increasingly enabled by information technologies, robotics, biotechnologies, and others. And it faces both threats and vulnerabilities. And so first, maybe to define that. So threats are something that comes from outside the system and impacts the system. And vulnerabilities are either a property of the system or within the system. And then risk is the combination of both, the product really of threats and vulnerabilities. And therefore you can reduce risk by defending or reducing the threat, or protecting or eliminating the vulnerabilities, or both. And the way I like to think about this, I tend to use a cyber example, but it's the idea of resilience, redundancy, and regeneration. And what I mean by that is resilience is you harden the system. In redundancy, the things that are most important, you have other ways of doing it. It may be degraded, but you can still accomplish the objective. And the last one is, can you start it all from scratch if you had to? Now with food security, as pointed out, is not really seen as a DoD function. And Sharon, I think you highlighted that clearly, and I think today the department would say we're focused on lethality and great power competition. But I think that's also similar to most critical infrastructure discussions in the department where ownership is primarily in the private sector. And yet there's times where the problem has become so big it becomes a national security issue, and DoD plays a role. And the most recent examples I could think of right off the top of my head is 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina. So I want to stop now and talk about 3 areas that are powering this system, I think, that are introducing risk vectors into the food system. So the first one is the integration of information technologies. So autonomous farm equipment, autonomous irrigation, just-in-time transformation, all the vast data sets being used to grow what, when, where, what to do to deliver just in time. It's all underpinned by hardware and software in ways that weren't even imagined 20 years ago. And this is only going to increase over time, and it introduces a complexity that's not well understood. The second is the connectedness. We're slowly continuing to connect all this together. And with 5G, even more is going to get connected to this. And linking these different systems together, I'm not sure we're going to fully understand what's happening to the inputs and the outputs. But even more importantly, because we live in a capitalistic system, we tend to drive, after getting the effectiveness, we tend to drive efficiency into the system. And then we start reducing the resilience and redundancy in it in the name of efficiency. And what that does, it's a reworking of the entire system. It drives out risk, but it also introduces new risk. And then the last area is speed, I think captured in the words of just in time. And in fact, I was talking to someone earlier before the break where they talked about home delivery is actually people are storing less food in their homes because it can be delivered just in time. And just think about the risk that puts in. But to me, everything's done faster, both because of the connectedness and because of the network effect created by the information technologies. So now it's a highly complex system, and there's a lot of books written about highly complex system, and I just want to highlight 4 points on vulnerabilities and threats. So the first one is the complexity of the food system itself. Because it's commercially driven, it's dynamic. It's evolving across different technologies and at the speed of human imagination. And this combines into a system that I believe is actually uncontrollable, fragile, and vulnerable to single points of failure. We just don't see them well. It's well covered in complex theory, but there's 2 subpoints. First, when I was in cyber, you get the assumption that, network systems are stable. Actually, they're inherently unstable. And once you recognize that, there's a tendency to pay more attention to the risk. But when you think they're stable, you pay less attention to the resilience and the redundancy that might be required. And the second is the idea of black swans. That could never happen until it does. And then that can have a disastrous effect in the system. The second threat is something that Sharon referenced, is this whole idea of hybrid war, or the gray zone, or war by other means, or actions taken short of war. But the bottom line, it's actions taken by potential adversaries or adversaries that stay below the threshold of war. And I think the National Defense Strategy captures this well in saying that we live in a state of competition. And so can we envision a future where the food system might actually become weaponized? We've already seen nation states directly impact critical infrastructures in other states, such as the electrical power grid in the Ukraine. One way that people do this is through cyber capabilities, because this type of competition comes in multiple forms through degrading or disrupting or even destroying parts of the system, but in a way that tries to stay below the threshold of war. There's also another use of what I call cyber-enabled economic competition, which widely people talk about in terms of the Chinese with the theft of intellectual property. But bottom line is gaining leverage of the system through economic means. The third part is what I call weaponized information. And obviously the election has, and the investigation has highlighted this, but what it does, it creates, people lose confidence, creates distrust, creates fear. It plays out every day in the media space across Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, by anyone who has access to the internet. It's all about using the information to influence human behavior. Now, just this week, Facebook admitted as fast as they figure out how to remove this, somebody figures out another way to go around it. That just supports the idea that it's a competitive environment. But for us, What could happen if nefarious actors just created rumors, spread those rumors, and amplified those rumors in ways that would impact the public trust in the food system? And then the final point is I want to highlight the lack of holistic understanding of the food system itself. How can you secure an unknown? Again, I'll go back to my cyber experience. So either on the defense or the offense, the first thing you do is you try to map and understand the network in detail. So what is the food system network in detail? And I think that's the fourth point that we need. So what does all this mean for security? Many parallels to cyber, right? So the first one is, everyone's impacted. The system's dynamic. It has a large commercial component. Security is an issue. Many different federal agencies involved, but also state, county, city, the governments are all playing, and the commercial sector. And so maybe five ways to think about maybe the future. One is some idea of a public-private partnership way of information sharing. In cyber, there's something called Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, ISACs. We can debate about whether they're effective or not, but the idea of some sort of information sharing at scale, I think would be a huge start. Second is there's a tremendous amount of information created by the intelligence communities of the United States that I say ends up on the floor. And what I mean by the floor is we use the information we need, we get rid of the information we don't, but all information can be useful, and there may be information in there that would be quite useful to building models that would provide continual situational awareness to understand the potential of shocks to the food system. The third is the opportunity to work within the Department of Defense and Department of Homeland Security on approaches to mitigate the cyber vulnerabilities that exist inside the food system. Because if you have to look at the different ways to come in, I think that is one of the primary vectors that will be used in the future. By extension, that can also be used for the cyber capabilities of partner nations. Fourth, in the department, we do a lot of war games. And in this case, I won't call them war games, but maybe scenarios, right? So food system scenarios that are at the scale where the federal government plays a role. So for natural disasters, the Federal Emergency Management Agency already has a playbook. And DOD actually has leads in some of these. The Corps of Engineers has leads, for example, in certain areas of this. What if we could create something like that for things that are large enough where DOD might get involved in? And the reason I say that's so important is it saves time if and when a crisis arrives. If not, I know what happens. I've been in the rooms many times. We'll put 500 people against the problem, right? And that's what we do. But if we would think about it in advance, it would help. And then the last one is not just that's internal to the U.S., but also maybe a scenario of a food stress region in the world outside the United States that could draw out the requirements and opportunities, not just for us, but for our partners to gain their awareness and understanding. So in closing, Molly, I just appreciate you and your team for all the work to put this together. I told her when I started this conference, when I found out I was going to be doing this a couple weeks ago, and I started thinking about this, she said, I probably should have been thinking about this a lot earlier in my life. And she goes, you've had the same epiphany many have had. So, but I do know there's some that say this will never happen. I was working for the Army Chief of Staff in September of 2001. And I would say that there were those on September 10th that would have said we would never ground every airplane flying inside the United States on September 11th. And yet we did. It all changed. And so to be prepared for what happens either in the U.S. or areas around the world that impact national security, it's prudent, and now's the time to prepare. And thank you very much, and I'll be around all day and look forward to talking with many of you. Thank you.
Thank you, General Cardona. And our next keynote speaker will be Igor Linkov with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and he will be amplifying some of the really important points the General made in his presentation.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be here and talk in such distinguished panel. Well, this first slide shows the core of the problem. We really know very little, as General just said, and from what we know, we need to see the rest of the iceberg. It's a very difficult task. So I will try to go a little bit how we see the world in my team, and related to food chain and supply chain ideas that we're discussing today. So this kind of my point that I like to make, and some of them already made, we need to really look at supply chain, food supply chain as complex system, and system analysis is necessary. The general introduced ideas of vulnerability, risk, and resilience. Molly asked me to go in more details what it really means. So I will try to do that. They're different and should be treated differently if we like to use right analytics to optimize supply chain in this case. And for that, we can use metrics and model-based approaches. I will try to introduce those. And finally, the idea of efficiency versus resiliency, sustainability is very important, but again, it should be based on the right analytics. And I think it's very appropriate to use Napoleon as inspiration for this, right? I spent 3 months in Paris, and we have our French colleague here, and I learned a lot about Napoleon. And one thing I learned is that he really pays significant attention to food, to the extent that he established a price to solve one of the main problems in French military of the time, how to preserve food. So 12,000 francs was a huge sum of money. They called for proposal in our current terminology. And 10 years later, Nicholas Appert pretty much invented canning the way we know it today. It hasn't changed. He published the book in 1810. And French military started to use it right away, talking about urgency. It looks like literally immediate implementation of new technology. Napoleon clearly realized that food is important, but what he missed is actually supply chain ideas. In our current terminology, his idea of supply chain was local. So when you go through densely populated countries, you can really get food immediately, right? Well, you have some cans and all that, but it actually was more important for Navy. But in Army, they try to draw from local population. So they already start failing when they get to Spain and Portugal, less populated countries. But when they get to Russia, of course, it was complete failure. It's huge land, no food, terrible weather condition. So supply chain was a major problem. And look at supply chain that we have now for food supply chain. This is UK from World Economic Forum. You can see a significant fraction of supply chain for food that we have is not local, it's global. So that's kind of highlight the importance of what we're talking today, global supply chain. And my interest in supply chain actually came from a completely different problem. We were looking at supply chains of explosives in Afghanistan, and the idea was, okay, it's resilient, right? How you deal with supply chain, how you target in a way that we disrupt them the most. But then I started looking at supply chain literature, and because it's the same problem, it's just in optimization, it's just reverse sign, whether you like to minimize or maximize. And what I found is supply chain is a huge field. You have some 100,000 papers in this field published over the last 20 years, and this is cumulative. If you look at supply chain risk, it's again very fast growth. You have now over several thousand papers on supply chain risk, and you can see significant increase from literally 100 papers to thousands now within the last 20 years. Resilience, I like to attract your attention. That is almost the same number of papers. So this is transition from ideas of risk to resilience, and the way I visualize it, you can see here evolution of supply chain, and if you are not resilient, you can fail. This was Napoleon problem. If you don't pay attention to resilience, which is ability to recover, your system can completely collapse. This is what Moll asked me to do. So if you look at Oxford Dictionary, and I think the problem is we don't do it too frequently, except maybe people like me who are foreign speakers and like to figure out what it really means. We have really good idea about risk. It's a situation involving exposure to danger or threat, and general introduced this idea. If you manage risk successfully, you are in state of security. You're instead of being free from danger and threat. That's all consistent in our current doctrines and the way we do business in the US government. But resilience is capacity to recover quickly from different difficulties. It's very different. If in kind of risk world, you start with a system that function well and your goal is harden it so it doesn't fail, in resilience world, you start with a system that is already failed and you like to recover it. If you are resilient, you recover it fast. If you're not resilient, you can collapse or recover it slowly. So this is very important to understand the difference. And how we deal with risk, this is where vulnerabilities come into the play. Risk was defined as the product of threat, vulnerability, consequences. As General pointed out, if you manage threat and vulnerability, minimize consequences, you lower the risk. And vulnerability is what you have as a property of the system. Threat is what is coming outside of the system, and consequences is what happens if specific threat acts on specific vulnerability and system is degrading. Resilience is very different. If you look at temporal profile of system evolution, you start with fully functional system, then you have an event and system gets down. At some point it starts to recover and adapt, right? So risk is just one point here. Risk is defined as probability of getting down, while resilience is more or less this area. You can have a system that goes down, but if it recovers fast, it's still okay. If I look at the sun without any eye protection, I may lose my vision, but in a few minutes, few seconds, and it's okay. Unless my critical function is to fly a plane, right? If I fly a plane, I cannot afford to lose vision even for a few seconds, so I need protection. So you can see the difference, right? Coming back to Napoleon again, Napoleon changed military doctrine in a sense. He introduced the idea that not only physical superiority, better weapons make the difference, but rather moral force is acting there. So we were talking with Scott here about needs to paradigm shift, right? So yeah, that was beginning of paradigm shift that actually resulted in network-centric operation under Rumsfeld. And I think this idea of military doctrine can be foundational to the supply chain resilience. Why? Again, the General already introduced, we are talking about multiple domains of the system. It's not just physical, it's also cyber. We need to know what's happening, not just to have better weapons or more food or whatever you can think about. But also, even that is not enough. We need to make decisions. We need to make right decision with that information. And even that is not enough. We need to place this decision in the right social context. So the problem in Afghanistan, Iraq is that partially that we really have difficulties is winning hearts and minds of people and all that. So this is new military doctrine. How it relates to food supply chain? It's very easy. So on the left you can see these domains. And on the right is how at least we are trying to model it. We like to model explicit network in cyber, physical space, with the idea that you need to identify targets that we need to impact, either to disrupt supply chain, that was my initial problem in this field with IEDs, or enhance supply chain resilience in food system or infrastructure, you name it. So the idea is to represent network-centric system with a network model and identify targets that you need to work on to improve it or disrupt, depending on your goals. So specific project that we have along those lines, nothing about food yet. I hope we'll get to that. But if you have command and control network or social network acting on supply chain network, you can model them explicitly, and you can really make sense of what are important component that needs to be acted on. This is kind of visualization, again, of a risk versus resilience difference. If you have this hierarchical structure, let's say command and control chain, if you disrupt it on the very top, from risk point of view, it may be catastrophic because the whole system fails if you disrupt on the top. But it may be okay from resilience, right? If I have several suppliers, I can replace them quickly. This collapse may be short-lived. Or if I target somebody at high level, and if that person can be replaced quickly, this is not optimal strategy. So it's maybe more important to see temporal pattern of the disruption or enhancement, right? So this is ideas about risk versus resilience. Risk doesn't have temporal component. It's just probability of system collapse. You need to think not only about how system collapses, but how it recovers. And this is very understudied area. So how we deal with it again, Napoleon apparently was not only a bright military leader, he actually get education through his knowledge of math. He get fellowship based on his math knowledge and ability to think about that. Even, I'm not sure if it's true or not, but one of the theorems is named after Napoleon. And if you look at his writing, he tried to really do some calculations. Okay, moral to physical is 3-to-1. Well, so it's kind of expert judgment coming from our leadership telling, how much attention we should pay on cognitive domain versus physical domain. Or in war, moral element and public opinion are half at the battle. So yeah, this is social. You now bring in, surroundings to that. So how it really relates to risk and resilience and ability to model? Well, in very general sense, you may be dealing with metrics-based approaches or model-based approaches. In metrics-based approaches, you try to see what can we measure about system and act on that. So you can use individual metrics or indices, dashboards. And I argue that you really need to move one level further and use decision analytics, and I will say a few words about that. While in model-based approaches, you can explicitly integrate all these networks through Bayesian models, statistical, game theoretical, agent-based models. So there are many tools how to deal with that. What we do in our team is that we kind of move, everybody now in the world of resilience deal with metrics-based approaches. We measure a couple of things and we act on those. Unfortunately, in a complex interconnected system, it's too simplistic. Like Einstein said, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. Right, so usually when you do metrics-based approaches, we measure what we can and we act on that. It's not necessarily what we need. So one way to deal with that, what we call is resilience matrix, and you can use it for risk as well. The key is to capture domains of system operation, physical, cyber, cognitive, and social, and then capture temporal pattern. So any complex system, in management of any complex system, you need to prepare to the event, absorb, recover, and adapt. So this is taken from National Academy of Science, and this is from military doctrine. And as a result of that, you get this 4x4 matrix. And if you put right metrics in these cells, and think about what is important for you through kind of Napoleon sense. This may be 3 times important than that because this is my mission. All of a sudden, you get this weighted sum of all your metrics that can represent the risk or resilience of the system through capturing all dynamics of interconnectivity, which is crucial for network-centric operation, right? So this is a simplified way to capture patterns of interconnectiveness and complex system. It's still metrics-based, so we still measure, but at least you need to think, well, how the system prepare in physical domain, how we adapt in social domain, do we have trained people, how we make decisions, do we have decision support system, do we look at right information, and so to say. The way we use it in our work, if you have this baseline resilience or risk, and you can enhance some of the metrics, you can see overall enhancement above the baseline. And you can comparatively select actions based on overall improvement in the system. Again, I have publication on that we'll be glad to share. But much more interesting way to deal with that is actually look at network side of that. We can model network explicitly, and I think I'm running out of time, but because I cannot publish classified work, we look at transportation network in Washington and 40 of the other cities. That's actually a really important problem. And what you can see is that some cities, like Washington in this case, are not efficient and not resilient in transportation network. But Los Angeles is equally inefficient, but it's resilient. It's one of the most resilient cities. Why? Because road network in Los Angeles is kind of a grid, and they have many small roads, while in San Francisco you have bridges and you get stuck. So you can see clearly efficiency and resilience may not be the same. And the reason is exactly the same as I shown before. In resilient system, you have redundancy, as General pointed out, and if one of these disrupted, you have many ways of doing the same thing. While in smart, efficient system, you have usually centralized control, and if something disrupted on the top, it takes a lot of time to really get it back. In supply chain, it's the same idea. We already introduced just-in-time and just-in-case methods of management supply chains, and just-in-time is very efficient, but it's not resilient. We saw what happened in Japan after Fukushima disaster. A just-in-time model for car manufacturer was completely devastated because they have very lean operation, and this disruption caused inability to produce car for 6 months. And another important issue is moving from supply chain to value chain. Because ultimately, you need to extract, as a business or as government, you need to have extract value for the military mission or business. And its interconnectedness of supply chain and value chain is important. But I think I don't have time to do that. So my final message is, and this is from my work with General Bostic in Army Corps, we really have risk approaches that focus on hardening supply chain, hardening the system, but the cost of that is exponential, right? It takes relatively reasonable amount of money to buy down many normal risks, but when you go to black swan events, they are extremely costly. So at some point, we need to say, well, we bought down enough risk, and we really need to think about how a system recover, because bad things are going to happen no matter how much we invest in hardening the system. So this trade-off point requires quantification, requires analytics, and I hope these meetings will be a starting point in our discussions how to do it right. And again, on my end, we published a lot. We'll be glad to share. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Igor. So these two talks have been offered to you to frame the terms of the conversation and to begin to highlight some of the diversity of methods that may be highly relevant to our work going forward together. What we'd like to do now is offer you three shorter presentations that will reflect on the first clause of the statute, which is in your program. And let me, before I introduce our three speakers, do two things. The first is I would like to highlight a book that has been fundamental in our understanding of this space called A Taste of War by Lizzie Collingham. I don't know if my colleagues have it here. This book talks about the history of food in World War II. 20 million food-related deaths in World War II, 19.5 million casualties. That story, I think, contains so many insights that are highly relevant for our conversations today. It also describes many of the technological and analytical, conceptual renovations related to the way food and conflict play out. But what I want to especially highlight in that book are a couple of things. That book makes it clear that it isn't just the control of food production and food distribution, but that it is also an ability to control patterns of consumption that were crucial for victory. We have other actors around the world who have, using fintech and biometric ID, have potentially much more ability to turn their population's consumption patterns on very short notice. The other thing to highlight in that book is the institutional innovations that were necessary, devised under extraordinary duress. The Battle of the Atlantic, for example, that meant that the Allies, with great trust and goodwill, invested in each other and in the ways in which these resources were allocated. This was such a stunning and important set of innovations that in the middle of the war, there was a critical meeting. And one of the very important actors, Boyd Orr, in this story, understood that the kinds of commitments to each other and to our future that were pioneered by the Allies in World War II could be highly relevant to the peacetime world that would follow. And so there were really two schools of thought exiting World War II. The first was that this commitment we had to our allies should be extended to all humanity, that the right to food was fundamental, and that we would, as a global community, come together around an intention to do better. That resulted in the founding of the Food and Agriculture Organization, which was specifically devised to live out those commitments. But at the end of the war, there was a competing school of thought. And so in the United States government, the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Department of Defense subscribed to the view I've just shared with you. But the U.S. Department of State, under Truman, had a different orientation and could see food as an instrument to advance American global hegemony. And so while the announcement was made that the U.S. was going to subscribe to the Food and Agriculture Organization with that vision, a shift occurred at the very last minute with an Undersecretary of State making a different announcement. And so we have three panelists, the first from the U.S. Department of State, the second from Hofstra University, Jean-Paul Rodrigue, who will pick up again on some of the issues of supply chains. And then the third, Phil Karsting, who is, among other things, Director of Policy for the World Food Program. I want to just quickly call out Franziska Gaup, who is going to wave to you in a sec. Franziska was going to be part of this panel, but her presentation is going to be a bit more technical, and we're going to put that presentation in breakout group 2. Franziska and a number of the others of you in the audience connect to an initiative we devised about 5 years ago called the Multiple Breadbasket Failure Initiative. The idea being that multiple breadbasket failure sounds important. We had no regular ways to generate relevant analyses of that, and it will be statisticians of Franziska's both caliber and generation that will be leading us to the kinds of methods and insights that will be necessary to forestall very serious challenges in the future. So with that, I'd like to introduce Rod Schoonover. Rod has been a very important partner for us and was especially helpful to me when we were given a cooperative research and development agreement with the U.S. National Geospatial Intelligence Agency called Food Security, Food Systems, and National Security Interests. So Rod.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks to the organizers, thanks to the Wilson Center. Always love coming back here. And the outstanding comments already, I think, really frame the problem quite well. I'm from the dark underbelly of the U.S. government, the U.S. intelligence community. I am the senior scientist in the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence. My background is in complex systems physics. I tend to look at the world through that lens in terms of fragility and connectedness, dynamic systems, emergent properties. And some of these same concepts are necessary to understand the global food system and their vulnerabilities. It's the job of the U.S. intelligence community to inform national security officials properly so that they are not in an entirely reactive mode. That's very difficult to do, especially with complex problems that we find ourselves in this century. Unfortunately, the U.S. intelligence community, and arguably the international analytic community, doesn't have a real deep understanding of the vulnerabilities to food shocks. And instead of echoing some points that I had that sounded, were actually more poorly drawn than the prior comments, I'm just going to talk about shocks very briefly. And usually I'm the person in the room who will say, enough with all the talk about climate change. Let's not overstate this stress. There are other human societal stresses that we ought to focus on. That said, I'm going to talk about climate change. And really, I think it's two pieces of the climate change story that are often underappreciated, but I think this group would get it instantly. And it's that when we're looking at potential shocks going forward, we often, so the ones that arise from climate change probably deserve special attention for at least two reasons that I can see. And these comments are hooked into the observation that otherwise resilient systems can show vulnerability to multiple points of disruption. So that's the overarching concept that I'm going to plug into. And so since the climate system itself is a complex system, one of the things that we know about distributions, statistical distributions of events in complex systems, is that evenly patterned events is the most improbable distribution, right? Equally spaced events in space and time. So if that's improbable and it evolves in some other way, you necessarily have clustering in space and time, or both. And so that clustering can, in itself, increasingly deliver these multiple stresses. And so, in my experience, not a lot of people are thinking a lot about those compound stresses. And so that's one point I want to focus on. Second, it's my observation that people think about climate change in a very weather-centric fashion. And what I mean by that, we often focus on heat waves, heavy precipitation, storms, droughts, sea level rise, melting. But if you think about how the planet works, if you were going to program a computer to emulate the planet, one of the control variables, along with sunlight, pressure, is temperature. And so this is a fundamental control parameter of the planet. And there's a multitude of chemical, biological, ecological processes that are dependent on temperature. Some weakly dependent, some very temperature dependent. And there's zillions of these processes happening at the same time. Even within a single organism, there's a lot going on. And we don't really understand what the net effect of all of these temperature dependent processes are. But one of the things that we should expect, see things like increases in agricultural pests. That's something that we've seen before. We should anticipate that. We should see disruptions in livestock, disruptions in fisheries. And then the thing that I worry a lot about, and something that I talk about publicly from time to time, just a whole number of climate-linked surprises, climate-linked ecological surprises. And if you want to get the attention of national security professionals, you talk about uncertainty and you talk about surprise, because those have great implications for how we operate in the national security sphere. And a lot of these surprises are things that, A, are possibly unknowable, and how are we going to build our system around that? And many, if they are knowable, we're not really probably devoting enough attention to ferreting out those things. So I could go further on just describing all of these shocks that scare me to death. But I want to end on the note that a great deal of science doesn't need to be completed, it needs to be initiated to understand this whole wide range of vulnerabilities. And many of these, I think, inarguably threaten national security, global well-being, and likewise. So thank you.
Thank you, Rod. With that, we'll move to Jean-Paul Rodrigue,
Should I stand up?
whatever you like.
I have a classic PPT. Okay, let's see. Okay, great. I'm a geographer by training, so if I cannot put something on a map, I don't understand it. So what I'm going to try to do here is try to map as much of the stuff as I can, and that was my attempt here to see what we are talking about. And I would say, if I can, just basic stuff. Again, it's very well known. And I was surprised when I start to look at this. Nobody's talking about that stuff, and it was so ill covered that I have to write a chapter in my book about it this year. And I start to teach about it to my students about these issues of freight distribution, food supply chains, food systems, which were basically absent from consideration. So at start, it's basically why we don't care about it too much is because we don't see it's a problem. Famines are gone, technically. It used to be basically caused by socialism, communism, and very big disruptions. And now those are essentially gone. Something very, very interesting as well from a supply chain perspective. The amount of food consumed on average by a human being has doubled or tripled on a per capita basis. This excludes packaging. And I've not measured that in terms of the amount of effort that we have to take into moving stuff around. Basically, because we eat more, and also because of all this packaging taking place, which is, again, subject to has kind of an impact about multipliers that are very, very big. We waste a lot of stuff. Again, measure depends on what you're looking at. Basically, 25 to 50% of all the food is wasted at one part of the process or not. It's very difficult to measure. And this is an attempt done by international agencies a few years ago about all the step by type where the food was lost. And again, it's substantial. A lot of it is lost basically at the consumer level. There's not that much you can do about this, and that's again complicated. But a fair amount of it is done at the distribution aspect. But we're getting way better at it. Why we don't care about it too much? Food is amazingly cheap by historical standards, and that isn't a way to measure it. The cost of food, if you measure it by number of hours work, has dropped by 80%. So that's again a reason why we don't care that much. It's available, it is cheap, and on the other hand, it is subject to remarkable fluctuations. This I call brain food, coffee. And you observe there are different markets, and each one of them have their own amazing behavior, how they respond to shock, hoarding behavior, which is subject to price shock because people are using this as a way of leverage. And again, you have to understand how the markets players are behaving. You might be surprised, especially commodities very often. A container ship or a bulk ship can be purchased and sold. The cargo can be sold several times while the cargo is en route based upon leverage. And the ship might be repositioned based upon if the demand has changed. This is for grain. So keep this in mind. And it's always about leverage. Let's see what else. So I came up with this cheesy concept, pun intended, the footprint. In order to calculate what is the amount of effort our civilization is undertaking in terms of providing it, in terms of the amount of land, the materials that we use, the labor, the equipment, the capital, and so on and so forth. And it's never been done. From a land perspective, it's quite clear that it is the biggest footprint of our civilization is food generation. There are maps. It's very well documented. And I won't be focusing on it. And I tried to map it, and it is excessively complex. A lot of stage involved from a supply chain perspective. It's a sequence. It's very usually linear. We try to put it, in a sense, recycling that into put it back. And I'm going to be focusing here on just that little circle here on the infrastructure, terminals, and facilities based upon it. And the rest, all the risks have been identified, categorized, the steps are involved. So that's one way you can think about this. And I created this because it was not provided before, surprisingly. I'm a container person. I love maritime shipping. It's a fascinating industry. And what I've noticed is food is becoming more and more containerized. It's moving away from bulk to containers. And this is, if you don't mind about this, it changes the actors involved, it changes the port of entry, it changes the supply chain because the mode has changed substantially. And wherever I look, but between 95% to 5% of all the food being moved on this planet is containerized in some way or the other. And we know very little about it. I tried, again, sorry, the quality of the color is not very good here. I was asking my colleagues, you have a map or an inventory of the grain port facilities in the world? Say, no, we don't. We have at the country level, and I start to give it a shot. I spent the last few weeks, and I came up with some kind of a picture of the grain capacity, port capacity of this planet. Again, we don't know. The commercial players know, but we don't have an inventory of these facilities. Same thing with container ports. This is, since the food is being handled by containers, this is the container level activity of this planet. And I'm going to show you some more accurate figures a little bit later on. But it's all I have to compile this manually myself because it's never been done. We don't know. And now we start to have inventories, and I start collaborating with others to have a better assessment. So we try to map it first. Here's something else. 85% of all the food carried in refrigerator containers, 85% of all what is carried in a refrigerator container is food. And nobody had any idea about the capacity of refrigerated container movement in the world. So I started to take every single container terminal on this planet and calculate and measure the refrigerated container capacity. And so that's one of the first maps ever produced about this is the refrigeration container capacity of this planet. And I realized I was shocked. Basically, 95% of all that enter in Russia for food enters in one port. They're much more vulnerable than we are. So we look at the United States, that's essentially the picture in terms of reefer capabilities, in terms of what's coming in, coming out, very different ports, very different systems involved here. And I'm going to be a little bit brief. And then I start to provide a mapping of all the container terminal facilities, their footprint. And this is a Los Angeles port complex, since it's containerized. And it's each of these facilities, you see that, is owned by different terminal operators, leased. It's owned by private interest, linked with different logistic chains, but it's only entering 2 or 3 major facilities in this country, and those something like, I would say, 60, 75% of all the trade and all the food coming in and out. So you start to map it. Yeah, I map the yard space. I'm going to map also the reefer. And this will enable us to model, to comprehend what are the capabilities available. And the good news is the capabilities for distribution are enormous. I'm not concerned about the capabilities, about the supply. The supply to move stuff is substantial, but it's all owned by private interest. 50% of all the trade in Mexico is controlled by one company in terms of terminal operator, private company, outside, owned by other foreign interests. That's New York. Again, I'm going to spend not too much time. Same story. All of these terminals are independent, but they all link with the same network. So, for instance, if you want to make this system collapse, there's just a few places you need to shut this down, and it impacts the whole system very, very, very quickly. There are very interesting choke point, nodal points in global trade, but also when all the freight moves in and out. And that's not been very effectively mapped so far. And I started to have a lot of fun with online stuff. It's absolutely amazing. And this is a map of the footprint of Amazon in the United States. Say, well, you care about this because now retailers are becoming grocers. That's one step. And now more and more food has been purchased online. And I'm going to start to measure, to comprehend what are the impact on the supply chain. It changes the footprint of it. The footprint is moving from the retail store or the grocery store to the distribution center. So the footprint of the food distribution is currently shifting very, very rapidly, and nobody seems to be noticing this from a commercial perspective. And again, that's the point I start to notice is again, I don't have that much data about that, is consumers are reducing their inventory because the system is efficient. And that's a paradox. This is weird. The more the system is efficient, the more people change their behavior, as expecting stability and this efficiency, which increase the vulnerability. And that's, again, one of those paradoxes I have a very difficult time to wrap my mind around in terms of efficiency, reliability, and it increase vulnerability. But you never know about it until you have a shock or something happens. And so far, nothing happens. And we're very, very, very lucky. So again, I'm going to skip that one. So as a conclusion, it's a paradox in itself. It's working excessively well, very efficient. But the complexity of the system is increasing to the sense that nobody understands how it fits, how it's organized, because it's many stakeholders, actors. And now it has been transnationalized. We saw a figure a bit earlier on about the UK. It's very, very high. So this increased the complexity of it. The second point is the distribution capabilities are substantial, but the point I would say, efficiency ability is an illusion of security. And again, that's the whole paradox behind it. And the last thing is we know very little about it. We don't have that much data. And when you want to look at it, you have to find it for yourself most of the time, paradoxically. The reefer inventory for me was a sobering discovery that it was not maintained. I have to find it up myself. I have to spend hundreds of hours to look at every single terminal to see their refrigerated capacity because food is carrying containers. And the more income increase, the more virtual goods are being consumed and the more dependent you're upon it. And we have a very little idea about this. Again, we can talk about that a little bit later on. But I'm starting to build a lot of data sets about this and start to understand mapping that system. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. So we're going to conclude with Phil Karsting.
I'm batting cleanup. All right. Well, thank you. First, Molly, I want to say it's good to be here, and thank you to the Wilson Center for hosting this. This is going to be an enlightening afternoon, and I think great conversations will ensue from this. I just want to make a little clarification. Molly introduced me as the Vice President for Public Policy at World Food Program. I'm actually at World Food Program USA, which is the 501c3 advocates for the UN's World Food Program here in the United States. So I can't really speak on behalf of the United Nations or any of its subsidiary organizations. But I have been around the block a little bit on food in the agricultural space. Grew up in Nebraska. In the Obama administration, I ran something called the Foreign Agricultural Service that many of you probably have never heard of, but they have ag attaches and about 100 missions overseas, and really a great reservoir of on-the-ground knowledge about food writ large across the globe. The World Food Program is one of those organizations that is also not very well known, I think, in a lot of places. But they're the world's largest humanitarian organization, and we focus a lot on feeding people in some of the most difficult places around the world. They do that with a whole lot of very talented people. They also have an incredible logistics operation. So I was telling someone from the U.S. World Food Sector, actually one of our major grain traders, how impressive WFP was. They have 5,000 trucks and as many planes as Alitalia, not the pretty ones, but the planes that can drop food and move food around the globe, and about 20 ships at any one time on the ocean, which sounds like a lot. And this person from a major corporation who I won't mention said, that's great. We have about 256 ships on the ocean at any one time. And the point of that story is that if we're going to get a handle on global food issues, and we're going to have 9.5 or 7 billion people on the planet by 2050, it's going to take the cooperation not just of humanitarian organizations and researchers, but the commercial sector, and finding some great ways to make sure that we're all integrated and that we have a strategic way of thinking about global food issues. As I mentioned, I grew up in Nebraska, and I went to land-grant university. And back in the day, I think, as Molly was dean at the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at University of Wisconsin when I first met her, there was a time 40 or 50 years ago where a lot of the food expertise in America was in our land-grant colleges, and that's changing a lot. And so, as a practitioner in that area, I am so glad to see our national security apparatus, our defense apparatus, NASA, everybody. Food is kind of sexy now, and food security is kind of cool now, and it couldn't come fast enough as far as I'm concerned. By the time George Washington University has a section on food and food security, I go, wow, that's a different place than the land-grant university, so it's really good. Our history in this, Molly, you mentioned the taste of war. On Tuesday of this week, I was in Independence, Missouri, talking to folks in Kansas City, and you realize that the first televised presidential address was Harry S. Truman, and it was about food in a post-World War II environment. Now, our history goes back, and it's a lot of places, but in every corner of this country, I think there are people who have a connection to food and some interest in seeing that our future takes into account a lot of these risks and potential challenges that we have there. One of the most interesting things I did when I was FAS administrator, and I'm not sure how much I can talk about it, but everybody knows our government runs continuity of operations exercises every once in a while, where you take the heads of agencies and they go somewhere else and try to game plan out what would happen if we had a major catastrophic event in this country. And in the course of that, I was dispatched somewhere in West Virginia, and you do these game plans and they inject new information along the way. And of course, being USDA and being a trade agency, we got injects of information relating to food systems. And if you ever, I don't recommend it because it's kind of scary, but if you think about what would happen in a port in America, or if we had a zoonotic disease that happens somewhere, the number of agencies and the amount of expertise it takes to deal with that is tremendous. It's not just USDA, it's the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, the Food and Drug Administration, the Customs and Border Patrol. It is the whole panoply of government organizations out there. And that gets me to my last point about, and there's an international or relief corollary to this too, is that we need to make sure that whatever we do and however we do it, we instill trust in institutions in this country. Because commercial actors and private sector actors and even consumers can be vulnerable to a lot of misinformation. And unless we have the trust of the American people and the people we serve, that gets a little dicey, and it can get dicey very, very quickly. The corollary to that, and I'm a Gemini, so that gives me license to have two personalities at one time and to hold two different concepts that may not be totally congruous. I talk a lot about the importance of having cooperation and not silos in our government and in our institutions. The corollary of that is that as we build these institutions, particularly in a development in a global conflict context, we want to make sure that our relief workers and everybody who's out in the field are seen and operate as apolitical because that's really important to their safety. And so we want to have a lot of preparedness and cross-pollination of ideas and solutions, but we also need to make sure that our relief workers and that our institutions here are not seen as political, because you can't do your job if everybody out there is thinking, oh, they're doing this for that political reason or for another political reason. So drawing those distinctions and making sure that our plans are coordinated and everybody has a high level of integrity as they carry them out, that's an important part that I hope we get a chance to talk about later.
Excellent. So thanks to all of you for bringing forward not only a lot of important information, but literally the terms of our conversation for today. I want to highlight one of our sponsors, Refinitiv, in the audience to this point about commercial data. As an academic, I knew that we frequently don't even have an adequate concept of data, never mind have access to it. And so over a several year period, my research group has formed a strategic relationship with Thomson Reuters and now Refinitiv to ensure that we have the ability to do what Jean-Paul has highlighted. And as it's logistics, it's price data, there's a tremendous amount of insight that is not well compiled anywhere. But we're very interested in the platform that Refinitiv has called Icon as a place for us to go for that sort of information. Second, I guess I also want to highlight Leo Holt in the audience. You're going to hear from him at lunchtime. Leo runs the Port of Philadelphia on the container port and the produce port across the river. And I was looking at which circles were over there on the East Coast, because some of those are very much Leo's business. And you're going to hear about Leo's perspective on this subject at lunchtime. What I want to do in closing this session out is circle back on the statutory language, which you will see around the Wilson Center and featured throughout the day. To Phil's last point about the politics, I began carrying the book A Taste of War around with me several years ago, and then I began carrying multiple copies around so that I could hand it out if I happened to run into somebody who was important anywhere. I happened to run into Senator Tammy Baldwin in the Detroit airport, and she asked me what I was working on these days. And I said, we'd just begun our relationship with the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and I told her, and she said, well, that sounds really important. I'd like to have my staff contact you. Before I was even on my second flight, her office had reached out, and by the time we had landed in Washington, we had a meeting with her staff. It was late in the game for the NDAA 18 process, but she was able to introduce an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act FY18 that included study language. And as you've heard, this is a problem set where even our vocabulary is inadequate, and certainly the other elements required to do a better job of wrestling this to the ground are not there. And so we had a kind of a pitched battle to get the language in place. It was greatly improved by a passage through the Senate Armed Services Committee. And as it came down to the wire, the Senate Armed Services Committee staff said back to Tammy Baldwin's staff, we're not going to do this. This is too far afield. Everybody's trying to hand DOD hot potatoes. We're not. This is going to be really difficult. And intelligence has already got this covered. One of our collaborators recently stepped down as chair of the National Intelligence Council, and he had been involved in generating a 2015 intelligence community assessment on food security. We happened to have him on email that night, ready to fire back to say, while that is a fine report, if I do say so myself, that report in no way approaches the issue of interest in the amendment. The next thing, there were backs and forths, and finally they said, the answer is no, we're not putting it in. And so I wrote back to my staffer friend and I said, is that because you think at the heart of it, they think this is not important? And he wrote back, yes. At that point, I was able, with the permission of its author, to send an email that had been provided to me by General Martin Dempsey, the most recent past chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he said, "Dear Molly, this language is much better. As you know, there is no extant doctrine to address this looming issue. Let me know how I can help. Cheers, Marty." And in fact, the language was included in the NDA 18, and today we will pick up clause 2 of the clauses. And I want to just read this out loud. It's in your program, and the language is really important. This was very hard won. This statute requires a study that provides an evaluation of vulnerabilities in the global food system that may affect the national security of the United States and the Department of Defense roles, missions, and capabilities in addressing such vulnerabilities, including information technology, data management, and surveillance capabilities for detection and assessment of food system shocks with the potential to result in the deployment of the armed forces or directly affect bilateral security interests with allies or partners. A report was returned to Congress recently, and I believe, will have several people who are critical in producing that report with us. The first breakout 1, is going to revisit this instruction with that report in hand and this community in the room. The second breakout is going to look specifically at building the analytical capabilities, both in terms of analysis and relationship to data, that will be essential in any type of systematic exploration through analytical simulations of this issue. And the third breakout will focus on the interaction between domestic preparedness and domestic vulnerabilities and national security and global issues. So I want to just close by saying the following. Rod's highlighted the strategy of, or the concern about compounded issues, and this area is rife with those. In 2015, I worked with Lloyd's of London to publish a set of scenarios that socialized the term food system shocks. And what we knew about that was we didn't know what a shock was, but it sounded important enough to Lloyd's to be of general concern. And so in the production of that report, I learned that the standard for relevance to that sector is a 1 in 200 year annual average return. In other words, if we run 2020 200 times, and the thing I'm worried about happens once in those 200 simulations, that is the regulatory standard for this industry. Well, I like how wide open that door is for these issues. One of the myths I think that underlies this is the things we're talking about are potentially likely to be rare. I think not. So informally, they asked if I felt this work met that standard. And we had done a scenario that took real things that had happened, compressed them temporally, and worked not just in agricultural production shocks, but infrastructure shocks. And I said, absolutely no problem. And they said, what would you guess, gut level, is the annual is the figure for this? And I said, I'm guessing 1 in 35, more or less. Well, in fact, the scenario we put forward involved floods in the Midwest and excessively high temperatures and a suite of challenges, including a disease, pestilence being a third horseman. And in fact, we are seeing a situation that looks alarmingly like that scenario this year, with the additional feature of a sustained period of low commodity prices, unprecedented farm exits. Wisconsin made cover of USA Today earlier this week for the number of dairy farms exiting last month. So what we thought might be 1 in 200 has moved to 1 in 35, has moved to 1 in 3 happening this year. And so as we go about our work today, as my colleague Peter said, the government doesn't collect the right data in the right institutions, to the general's point. We are not sitting on a proper analytical foundation, as you've heard, and we actually are sparse on the theory that underlies or that would guide this. And that no data, no analytics, no theory, he said, sounds like a challenge for DARPA. Well, DARPA has already done one program called World Modelers, spurred in no small part by interactions with this community. And we think that there really is, the deficits are monumental. The potential vulnerabilities are staggering. I think Jean-Paul once called them monstrous, I think. And we're all very glad you're here to join in community to tackle these problems together, because that's what it's going to take. So with that, I'll thank again our panel and our distinguished keynotes, as well as those who welcomed you. And we will invite you to coffee break and ask that you be back precisely at 10:45. Thank you.